Okay, brilliant. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming along. I've seen quite a few more people are joining in now, so we'll get started. James, are you able to join me? I think I can hear you, but I can't see you yet. Do I need to give you access?
Hi, Will. Yes, I believe you do. Yeah, trying to turn on my camera.
Okay, can you give that a go now?
Yeah, here I am. Hi,
Brilliant.
guys, everyone.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Yeah, thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us. What we want to do today is talk a little bit about university applications. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's introduce ourselves. So my name is Will. I am the head of consulting at UniAdmissions. It's my job to make sure that our team of consultants all know what they're doing, and we're able to give the best advice possible. We're able to make the best recommendations possible. My background is I studied at Oxford, so if there are any Oxford specific questions near the end, I'd be really happy to help you out with that. James.
Yeah, hi, guys. Nice to meet you all. I am having some sound issues, so apologies for the pilot's headset that I'm currently wearing. I'm an admissions consultant, so my job really is to speak with students and parents, get a really good understanding of your application and see if and how we could support you with it, really.
Yeah, brilliant. And for those of you who don't know what UniAdmissions is, I'm not quite sure how you'd have managed that whilst also enrolling yourself for this, but we sort of see ourselves as a preparation school for the competitive universities. So Oxford and Cambridge, a lot of our students are applying to, but equally, competitive courses like medicine, like law, and we host these open days pretty much every week nowadays as a means to talk about different important parts of the application process, and for us to answer questions that you guys might have. It's worth saying at this point, there is a Q&A function, so please do drop your questions in there, but don't be insulted if we're not responding to them as we go through. What we'll do is we'll basically come back to them at the end of what we're talking about, which is wider reading. I don't know why I'm being so mysterious about it. We're going to be talking about wider reading. And basically at the end of everything, we'll then be taking questions. So if a question pops up whilst you're watching, do just write it in. It won't get answered right away, but at least it won't be forgotten. What you don't want to do is come to the end of it and then not be able to remember what you wanted to ask. So yeah, this week we're talking about wider reading. Next week we'll be taking a bit of a deep dive into medicine specifically. So we've tried to make this wider reading as broadly accessible as possible. Naturally, some of you might be thinking, well, this might be a bit more applicable for certain subjects over others. And that is true, but we're trying to basically make it as broadly appealing, whereas next week it really will be specifically for aspiring medics. So if you are a aspiring lawyer, you can take next week off, enjoy your Saturday afternoon, but we'll see you the week after. But yeah, let's dive right into it. Wider reading, it's something which I'm sure many of you, if you are students, have been thinking about. I'm sure it's something that your school has been telling you about. I'm sure it's something that you've seen in blogs about applications, but you might be thinking, well, what really is it? How do I go about it? What does it mean? What is it for? All these kind of questions which aren't always answered. And this is where our open day comes in. So we're going to break it down into, what is actually the point of reading? What is it there for? Then we'll talk a bit about, well, now I know that I need to be doing some reading. How do I go about it? What should I be doing? And then how do we actually apply that in the personal statement, in the interview setting? James, I'm sure lots of students have said to you, why should I be doing wider reading? I'd much rather be, I don't know, doing something else. What kind of things do you tell them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think particularly now, because a lot of students have or are sort of breaking up for the summer periods, and this is the sort of time where you've got a little bit more time to sort of engage with this. So absolutely, wider reading is something that comes up a lot. Obviously, we're going to go into why it's important and sort of how best to go about sort of getting started with it. But it is very important.
Yeah, definitely. It's something which you're right. Now that you've got the time, you might have been using the excuse of school over the last few months. You're too busy, but now that's gone. And we all know that there aren't as many holidays this summer either. So students don't really have any excuses for not diving right into their subjects. It's worth saying at this point, if the concept of wider reading puts you off, if the thought of having to spend hours reading about the subject that you're wanting to study at university is not a fun idea to you, then in the politest possible way, it might be worth wondering whether or not actually Oxford or Cambridge is the right place for you to go to. Because whilst you'll be spending a fair bit of time reading around your subject before going, you're going to be spending a lot of time reading around your subject once you're there. So if you are sat there thinking, I know I need to do wider reading, but I sort of see it as a chore, it might be worth having a deeper think in terms of actually whether or not you're applying for the right subject. Because if you find one subject a chore, maybe there's another subject which you do enjoy. But equally, it might be that somewhere like Oxford and Cambridge isn't the right place for you, because there's going to be a hell of a lot there, once you're there, or if you're there. But ultimately, there's also nowhere you can hide really with wider reading. You might be sat there thinking, well, I do maths, so I don't have to do any reading. It's not really the case. Yes, when you're at university, there's going to be a lot more focus on problem sheets. And certainly they're going to be very interested in how good you are at maths. But they're also going to be quite keen on seeing, well, how interested in maths are you? Have you done what you've been told to do at school and then left it there? Or have you, outside of school, gone above and beyond that? And there's lots of ways you can do that, but wider reading is one of the best ways to do it, because it's very, very accessible. And it's also very, very broad. So there's loads of ways that you can engage with it ultimately. And yeah, ultimately, there may be certain things which you are thinking, yes, I can get away without reading, but there will still be things to read. So what a lot of the STEM subjects will end up doing is, instead of reading as many books, they might be spending more time reading scientific papers. One of the things that I often say to students is, actually, you really do want to have come to interview having read at least a few papers, because if you are a STEM subject, it's likely you might have to read one at interview. And if that's the first time you've ever gone through a research paper, then that's going to be quite tricky. Not only are you under the pressure of speaking with Oxford or Cambridge professors, but you're also having to read something that you've never really experienced before. So certainly you want to be doing that well in advance of getting there, and you want to have done it quite a few times. And again, not because you feel like you have to, certainly you should feel like you should, but because it should be something that you find quite interesting. The alternative is you can rock up to your interview and you have to read something like this, and it can be quite dense, if it's not something that you've had that much experience with before. Ultimately, this is going to make a lot more sense to someone who's hoping to study something like chemistry or biology potentially, and much less sense to someone who's wanting to study law. But equally, someone who wants to study maybe biochemistry but hasn't read a scientific paper is still going to find this quite tricky, despite if they've read things in textbooks, right, or anything like that. It's certainly a very different way of expressing information, a research paper. So we talked a little bit about why you should read. You don't want to be caught off guard at the interview. You want to be demonstrating your interest. It should be, you need to be pushing yourself above the A-level side of things. But ultimately, what specifically should you be looking into? And there are a couple of things that you can do about this, and there are a couple of different ways that you can approach it. And different people will tell you different things. Ultimately, a combination is best. So you can go deep or you can go broad with your reading. What I mean by this is, let's say you are interested in law. You could either spend all your time reading about, let's say, patent law. You're really interested in patent law. And so you read and you read and you read, and you keep going deeper and deeper, and you develop your understanding in patent law. So that's going deep into a subject. Going broad would be to spend some time on patent law, spend some time on family law, spend some time on criminal law, spend some time on international law, exploring more topics, but in a more shallow way. Now, ultimately, it's quite difficult to only do one. and not do a bit of a combination, because what you should find as you're going and as you're going through your reading is that let's say you start with patent law, that's kind of interesting, but not really your cup of tea. And then you move on to the next one, family law, same thing. You move into international law, but that's really interesting. It's quite difficult to stop yourself from wanting to delve deeper into it. So ultimately, it's good to have a combination. Good breadth to get you started, to help you explore different subjects. But once you find particular ones that you're interested in, then going into it in much more detail. That way, when you come to interview, you've not only got a decent understanding of a broad range of things in your subject area, but you're also able to demonstrate to them that you spent a lot of time thinking about particular things and you've developed a little bit of expertise in that area as well. Okay. So how can you start? Of course, teachers will always be able to help you out with this. There will be people at school who will be able to give you a bit of guidance. You can always browse the reading lists that they give you whilst you're at university, and you can usually see these on, for example, they often have it on the course information pages, but they also have reading lists given for different subjects, which are often available. If we're thinking about, you know, going broad and growing deep, what's often helpful is to start broad. So maybe start with a review, start with a textbook covering lots of different things. And then from there, you'll be able to find particular things, and you'll be able to find articles that it links to, books that it links to, that you can go deeper into it. I mean, James, what kind of things do students say to you that they struggle with their wider reading?
I think there are two things that I come across. Is first, it's quite overwhelming. If you haven't been the kind of person who has been reading throughout your sort of A levels or equivalent, and then you suddenly get to this point now and you're thinking, right, I know I need to start this. That feeling of, oh, wow, where do I begin is quite daunting. I'd obviously echo what you said, go to the course page of the course that you're hoping to study, because the universities have compiled a list of great texts to start with. So that would be a really good way to begin. Secondly, think about why you're reading. Okay, so it's not just about arbitrarily trying to read every single thing that you can sort of manage to do in 24 hours. Think about what the purpose behind doing the reading is. And you've obviously sort of talked about that a little bit, Will, and I think we're going to mention that a little bit later as well. So yeah, those are the sort of two things I think students are most concerned with. Hopefully, we'll give you some good advice as we go along.
Yeah, definitely. And one of the mistakes that I see a lot of students falling into is they see, okay, Oxford's reading list, and they blast through it. They read it, go through it as quickly as they can. They say, yep, I've done it. Fantastic. Box checked. But like you said, Jace, they miss the point. They don't really interact with those books like they should. They don't really think about them whilst they're reading them. They sort of read them for the sake of it. And at the end of it, you don't come out of it being able to discuss that book at an academic or even a thoughtful level. You've ingested information as quickly as you can, but you've not really considered it. And one of the key things, and like you said, we will come on to this later, is they're looking for the way that you consider the information that you're engaging with. Not necessarily they're looking for the person who can read the quickest. So I said at the bit earlier, a review is a really good place to start if you're new to an area. But what you don't want to do is be overly dependent on these things. So you can see at that last point there is really trying to make sure that you don't rely heavily on breadth, and you don't rely too heavily on other people's opinions. So if you read a scientific review paper, it will generally be one researcher's opinions on the various amounts of research in the field. And that's a really good way to basically point you to research in the field. But actually, you don't want to then neglect reading those individual papers, because you want to be able to engage with those. And it might be that actually the reviewer's interpretation is biased or wrong for whatever reason, but you'll miss that nuance if you don't go into the specifics yourself. There was a bit of a tendency amongst students when I was at university to basically only read the abstract of a research paper, because when you've got hundreds and hundreds to get through and you've got essay deadlines, you need to try and take in as much information as you can as quickly as you can and then use it. But actually, when you have time like the summer holidays, and you've got the time that you have, and if you're clever with your time and you put away time to this reading regularly, you'll have the time to actually go through the paper properly, go through the methodology, go through the results, and then you'll be able to make your own conclusions. And that really is the way to interact with a scientific piece of reading in a thoughtful way. When you're looking at, I guess, the humanities side of things, yes, you've got textbooks which will take you through broad things, but actually, maybe a huge period of history, you'll have a textbook for World War II or whatever it is. But actually, you want to be looking at primary sources. You want to be looking at primary information, because that's actually where that's what you'll be doing later on, and that's the kind of skills that they're looking for when it comes to the interview.
I would just add to that, Will. Actually, I think it's about it's not just sort of reading as much as you can. It's about the way that you read as well, and maybe that's a topic for a whole different webinar.
Yeah.
But sort of analyze. Don't just read. Think about what you're reading. Sort of try to form your own sort of opinions and things as you're going along. Again, it's not just about arbitrarily reading every single thing that you can get your hands on. There's got to be a real purpose behind the reading that you're doing. And you want to be able to get to the end of the reading and sort of really have some clarity about what you've just read, rather than just being like, oh, wow, I've read that one, tick that box. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I often say a good sign of if you're reading wrong or if you're reading the wrong stuff is if you get to the end of the book and you haven't written any notes about it. Normally, if I were to read a book and I read something that was interesting and made me sort of question it, I'd be straight on my laptop and I'd be jotting down notes and ideas. If you don't do that and you get through a whole book, it's either because the book is rubbish and wasn't engaging and wasn't talking about anything interesting, or you weren't engaging with the book properly. And if any of you are thinking, well, actually, I've gone through quite a few books and I don't have any notes about them, then you might have actually wasted a fair bit of time there. What you want to do is maybe not reread, but certainly go back over and actually have a proper think about those books. So what we've got here is an example. So I asked the research team to put together some examples of the kind of things that we hear quite a lot from students. So some examples, some different subjects of the kind of things that students will have engaged with either before they've spoken with us or all the way through their application process when they're doing things on their own. So there's quite a big focus in A-level, certainly, and in GCSE on the world wars. And what students often do is if they aren't doing any wider reading, then that's all they have. All they have is information about the world wars. But if they do wider reading, they often can fall into the mistake of just reading more about the stuff they already know. So that you do end up getting a lot of depth, but actually it's not necessarily going to be that different to most other students who've already studied the same kind of thing because they've done A-level history as well. And actually quite a, you're missing a lot else that goes on when it comes to history. It's very short periods, but there's a huge amount of focus on it in the school system. You've got the opportunity to find things that you find interesting beyond that. There's also, again, a fair amount of focus in that. Again, it's been a while since I studied A-level history myself, but there's a fair amount of focus on textbooks and not too much in terms of actually specific primary sources. And that, again, is a bit of a mistake that we see in a lot of students. And again, it's because textbooks are easier, that you can find them off of Amazon and then they tell you a lot, but actually you do want to go into things in a bit more detail on the primary source area of things. So that's the history. We've got one for law as well. So this is a less strong, the last one was okay. This is certainly a less strong collection of readings. Ultimately, there's basically a focus on the spotlight books. So across every subject, there's a couple books that everyone will have read and doesn't really make you stand out. And so these are two examples of that for law. It's fine to have read them, but it's really not fine to have only read them. That's going to put you in a position where you don't stand out in terms of your interest in your subject. There's also a lot of lawyers that I speak to, James, you might agree, have spent a lot of time watching law-related TV.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so this is great as a way to get interested in law, but really not a way to demonstrate your interest in law to somewhere like Oxford or Cambridge. You really do need to be focusing a bit more on the higher level, the academic side of things. One other thing that students often get wrong is I suppose they don't, when they're reading, they don't evaluate both sides to things. It's very easy to corroborate your own ideas with the things that you're reading and forget to consider other things. And one thing that Oxford or Cambridge aren't really interested in are students that are effectively indoctrinated and dogmatic in the things that they think. They want to see people who can evaluate information well. And so a bit of a bad sign to Oxford, because Cambridge don't take the LNAT, but they would take the CLT, is actually if someone's seen a really interesting question of the death penalty in the essay and just sort of rambled on and on about how they think it's great or not great, rather than actually evaluating the evidence. And like James was saying, this does link into actually being thoughtful when you're reading and reading properly. Don't just take in the information, do evaluate it, do question it. Because there may be some things which either a research paper hasn't considered or an author is sort of overemphasizing, and those are the kind of things which are actually where the interesting stuff happens.
I would just say to that, Will, because this always gets me quite excited. In my past life, I was an examiner for the IELTS exam. And this is something that we would come across all the time in the writing section, just sort of one opinion. I know this is quite a sort of specific thing we're talking about, but trying to evaluate both sides. And also when you're reading, not just looking for information that sort of adds to your opinions, but trying to sort of see both sides of the argument as well. And to talk about that.
Yeah. Definitely. Don't just affirm your own ideas, allow yourself to think about other things. Absolutely. And we've got a final example now, a STEM related example, which is definitely better in terms of getting involved in different things. So it's being interested in science fiction might to some people seem like a really terrible thing, but actually there are ways to engage with your subject across a number of different modalities, and if that's one of them, that is great. You do, like I said, a bit with the law TV, you still want to be engaging with your subject on an academic level, but there's nothing wrong with there's nothing wrong with watching Suits every, I don't know how often those episodes air, every day or whatever it is. But you don't want that to be the defining feature of your interest in your subject. And certainly in terms of going through these other books, again, it's certainly a starting point, but you've picked out some key texts and you're learning about specific people relevant to your subject. So it's certainly getting a bit more in the right direction compared to that lawyer. Okay. And you should see, again, so physicists amongst you might be thinking, well, I wasn't planning on doing any wider reading, but there's still certainly lots of things that you can be doing. And I wouldn't discount it just because you think it doesn't apply to your subject. I would try and explore it as much as you can.
I'd also add that actually with some subjects, for example, the sort of STEM subjects, a lot of the time the universities have done their own research as well into different parts of your subject. So if you could be reading kind of a research paper that was actually conducted through the university, I mean, that's a way to go about this too. What do you think about that, Will?
So you do see that quite a lot. The one caveat is don't fake it. So don't pretend to be really, really interested in their research yes. If you're not. If you see stuff that is happening at Cambridge and you think that is absolutely amazing and you read more about it, that's great. But don't make things up. I'll talk about that a bit later. Don't try and suck up too much. Enjoy the work that's been done, research it, great, go through it, understand it, fantastic. But yeah, don't try to over egg it too much. That is the one thing that students often misunderstand. It's great to do it, but everything in moderation. So yeah, as a bit of a, I suppose, a bit of a recap of the things that we've been talking about so far. Certainly looking at primary sources, so the specific research paper, the specific, whether it's taking history as an example, the letters that were written between X and Y, those kind of things. Those are really, that's a really good thing to be handling at your age. Not only because it should be really interesting, I mean, not really handling, but you'll be able to find a PDF. It should be really interesting, and it should also set you up quite well. Look for writers who disagree. Don't just read one narrative. Do read multiple things. Rarely, people often say, well, science, all the scientists, they all know X, Y, and Z, but actually, usually it's a lot more disputed than that. Usually for every science who thinks one way, there's another one who thinks the exact opposite. And ultimately, you don't want to be missing out on really interesting evaluative opportunities because you've not exposed yourself to it. And you can often see, especially in reviews, which is why reviews are a good place to start, you will often see the different sides of arguments, and then you need to throw yourselves into it. Don't read about things that you aren't interested in. Ultimately, if it's something that you really don't like, don't force yourself through it. Think about why you don't like it. Try and evaluate what isn't interesting about that topic for you. Because it could just be that the author that you're reading is very dull. That does happen. It could be that the paper that you're reading is, didn't find anything that interesting, so it's a bit unexciting. So it could be that you're not interested for a number of reasons, but if it's just the fact that a certain area within your chosen subject isn't interesting for you, that is fine. You will find other areas that are interesting for you, and you can spend much more time on them. It will be helpful to still know the stuff that you know about that topic and to have asked the questions that you've asked about that topic, but you don't have to carry on going down that route if it's not one that's good for you. And one reason why people don't like wider reading sometimes is because they've done just that. They've felt like they had to read particular books because they're on particular lists, and they've forced themselves to go through it. They haven't taken any notes because it's boring for them, and then they end up not wasting, but I suppose losing a lot of time, which could have been spent in a different way. Okay, so we know we ought to be reading. That's hopefully very clear. You've seen some examples of the kind of things that people do read, and we've sort of commented on what you can be doing around that. But how is this reading going to be evaluated? Where do we put it? What do we do with it? Oh, sorry, I've skipped ahead there. So the first one is the personal statement. That's naturally the first thing that Oxford or Cambridge are going to see about you. And sometimes, so on that first point, in terms of giving 3 or 4 texts or papers or whatever it is, sometimes people think, great, I'll read 3 or 4 texts. No, read many more so that you can pick out the things that you find very interesting and the things that you've got thoughtful things to say. Do spend time. It doesn't really benefit you to be name dropping books without any level of evaluation on them. They want to see that you've read that. Okay, great. But they want to see what you thought about it. They want to see if you had anything interesting to say about it. So if you do just say, I've read X, Y, Z, and J, and they're all very interesting, that doesn't actually add that much to your personal statement. They want to see that evaluation. Mm. You're very much able to have a certain topic that you find more interesting. So, don't feel like you have to give every single book that you've mentioned the exact same amount of time or the amount of characters or lines. You are allowed to say, I find X or Y one of the most interesting things that I've been reading because of, whatever it is that makes you interested in it. But it's that balance, right? that balance of breadth and depth. You can go into that main area in good detail, but do make sure that they know that that's not the only thing that you have been looking into. And touching on what we were saying about the one-sidedness, don't feel like you have to sort of unquestioningly talk about these books. You shouldn't start saying that X author or Y author is stupid and they don't know what they're talking about. But you can definitely say that when you were reading it, you thought that they were, that their sampling techniques were poor, or whatever it is. Perhaps they're biased by the sources that they've been using, that kind of thing. You can definitely raise questions about the things that you're reading, but you don't have to. You can do that in a articulate and academic way, rather than saying, "I read this book. This guy, what a fool! He doesn't know what he's talking about. I know much better than him." Okay. So yeah, quite a few things to think about on the personal statement. And you will, students often ask me, will I get asked about the things I put in my personal statement in my interview? And it's highly likely that you might. Different tutors, different college professors will approach the interview differently, so that there's no one size fits all approach. It is standardized, but they do approach things differently. And so some college tutors might focus a lot on the things you talked about, the personal statement. Some might focus on things that they want to talk about a bit more. But you'd certainly want to be going into that interview with an understanding that you might be asked about things you talked about, and with an understanding as to what kind of things you might say in response to that. So using my own experience, I was asked quite a few questions about my personal statement and about the things that I talked about in the personal statement. So it certainly is helpful to at least have looked at it again, because it will be about 2 months between submitting that personal statement and having your interview. So very easy to have forgotten stuff. So at least review it. Certainly have a think about, what kind of discussions could arise from this, and what kind of things would be interesting to talk about. You don't have to prepare stuff. You don't have to prepare line for line responses to absolutely every single question that comes up. But you might want to refresh yourself with the content, refresh yourself with the books you've talked about or the articles, and just have an understanding as to what kind of things you've left open in the way you've talked about it. And of course, since then, you might have read more. So you might actually have more ideas about something. So you might want to have a bit of a practice where if they ask me this about this, I've actually been reading a few more articles. So how might I use those to inform what I'm concluding at the moment? How do they affect what I've read originally? So you can definitely practice using those texts, using the things that you've been reading in a way to make yourself feel more comfortable at the interview, but also to give yourself more ideas in terms of what kind of things you can be talking about. Okay.
I would also add, and it might sound quite obvious, but actually practice verbalizing your responses as well, rather than just thinking about what you're going to say. Because when you inevitably have to talk about something, you'll find that it's very different when you actually are sort of talking about it than thinking about it. So that's sort of a tip for me, I'd say.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of you that don't have anyone who can help give you mock interviews, just find someone who can't really and give them questions to ask you. But for those of you who really don't have anyone to practice with, use a mirror, record yourself, that kind of thing. It's much better than, like James says, just sort of having it in your head. And you can then, of course, if you've recorded yourself, you can then review it and go back through and think, how did that sound? Did I sound like I was making a sensible point, or was I talking nonsense? So yeah, definitely make sure that you haven't put anything in your personal statement that you haven't actually read. Don't start talking about books if you've only read the first few pages. Or if you have, definitely read the rest of it before your interview. Again, you've got another 2 months there, so really no excuse if you've put it on your personal statement. And don't, that will make sure that you're then set up in the best way possible. But I think the key 2 points here are the bottom two. Don't just make things up. If you're not sure about something, you don't sort of have to make things up, but equally you don't have to say, I don't know, can we move on? There's a very happy medium where if you're uncertain about a question or a topic, then you can explore it with them. That's certainly the route that people should be taking, rather than sort of blagging their way through things or just giving up. And remember, for the interview side of things, they want to see how well you learn, how well you handle new information. So it's fine if there's something that you learn on that interview. You should learn something in that interview. You shouldn't walk into it expecting to give them a bit of a monologue about all the things that you know. It's not really what what the interviews are there for. So, there's a lot of ways to go about preparing for an interview, but it's really important to make sure you've got the right approach. And that is set up, you have a similar approach for the personal statement. Don't make stuff up in the interview. Don't make stuff up in the personal statement either. Okay. Anything to add, James? Any stories you have of people getting unwound or?
Well, I just sort of echo what you've said about not making things up. Make sure you've read your personal statement. I mean, it just sounds so obvious, doesn't it? But in the sort of stress of all of this, make sure you're really familiar with your personal statement, because obviously by the time you interview, you will have submitted that personal statement, a few months before. You don't want to get to the interview and not really remember what you've been writing about. And definitely don't talk about things that you haven't really read in detail. I think that goes without saying, doesn't it? But do remember that, because it happens every year.
Yeah. And one other thing which didn't happen for me, but I have heard has happened for certain people, is if you are doing a subject which has a admissions test with an essay component, I have heard of students being asked about the essay that they wrote in the interview. So it's worth, when you pop out of your TSA or LNAT or whatever it is, just jotting down, making a note of which question you picked, what you were talking about, what kind of arguments you made. And again, that's not really something that you need to then prepare line for line what kind of responses you'd give in an interview setting. But just so that if they say, we found your essay quite interesting, can you tell us more about point X? Just so that you aren't completely taken aback by the fact that they've brought it up and you can't actually remember what you talked about in that essay. Okay. And obviously, wider reading is a really important, it's a very important part of the application, but as with everything we do, we like to take it into consideration with everything else that's going on. For those of you who've come to previous open days, you will recognize this chart, but for those of you who haven't, James, can you take us through?
Yeah, so this is indeed the iconic pie charts. What we're really doing here is trying to identify the parts of your application and how they're weighted respectively against each other. So as we see generally, it does sort of vary from university to university, but as a really good rule of thumb, your academics account for about 30% of this application. The admissions test itself counts for another 30%. Your interview accounts for another 30%. And then sort of that 10% that's everything else, that's a combination of your personal statement, your academic references. So I think it's a really good way to think about your application. Schools quite often will give a lot of focus to the personal statement, because really that's what they sort of feel most comfortable helping with. And I think sometimes that can skew in a student's mind where the sort of priority should be for them. And we always see across all of the different subjects a really clear correlation between test score, invitation for interview, and beyond that offer. So it's just something to really bear in mind in terms of how you go about preparing for this. And yeah, there we go, the pie chart.
Yeah, definitely. And actually this pie chart is a little bit predictive of what we think will happen this year, because what we've noticed is that actually the grades become less and less important, given that no one's actually sat their exams. So for the first time ever, the only standardized test that Oxford or Cambridge has about you, the candidate, is your admissions test. So it was important before, but you can bet it's going to be very important now because it's the only standardized measure they have of everyone. Because the GCSEs, yes, you've been given grades, but they won't be seen as reliable. And now we can see, based on where wider reading comes in, that wider reading has an impact on that yellow everything else wedge, but also on the gray interviews wedge. You know, it's not certainly not going to make up all that interviews wedge, but it does contribute to how well you can perform there. So making sure you're doing it right is definitely important. And of course, we have our approach of trying to make sure that our students get things right. And James, can you sort of take them through the way that we approach the application process?
Yeah, so I mean, we are very much a prep school. I think that's an important distinction. Tutoring is part of what we do, but actually we have programs of support, aiming to be as sort of comprehensive as possible, really, and support the application itself. So typically a program support has 4 parts to it. So the first of which is one-to-one tuition. So, our aim here is to select a tutor for you who has been through this process successfully themselves. Okay. And the idea really is to sort of identify where those gaps are in your knowledge, and then to really work on making those incremental improvements over the year. I think I should say, our approach to this has always been to start as early as possible and to really work consistently. I think the data shows that cramming is just a terrible strategy. Particularly in test score, there's the point of diminishing returns, isn't there, ultimately, with test score. I think the value of one-to-one tuition is making those sort of incremental improvements over time. So yes, one-to-one tuition is the first part of a program.
And we've got a report here.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously it's important that you, the student, but also parents, we want you guys to be engaged in this as well. So after every session with the tutor, a report is written detailing what you guys have done together, what's been worked on, what you're doing well, where those gaps continue to be, and what the plan is to sort of tackle those. I think that's really important as well. It's about really understanding where you are in this process of preparation. So sort of tutor reports are quite a big part of this too. All right. Okay. So secondly, we have the sort of resources and materials. So many students and sort of parents are aware of a lot of our textbooks. We have a lot of really sort of popular, some award-winning textbooks, but as part of a program, aside from those textbooks, we actually have an online preparation portal. And actually, we do have reading lists for the different subjects on the portal, which is important to note as well. But the portal contains the learning for the different subjects, particularly tests, question banks to practice test questions, and then time mock testing as well.
So we do have, I think we have a little demonstration of this.
Do we?
Play in the background whilst you're talking.
Beautiful. Synchronized very well.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, so I get the idea really is to be working with a tutor, and then between those sessions, again, it's about that consistent engagement. So the tutor is setting the work to do using all of these materials and resources so that you can prepare, but in quite a structured, sort of focused way. So yeah, the second part of things are resources and materials.
Yeah, hold on, I'll let this run out. But yeah, you can see the ultimately having a tutor is fantastic, but it's not a substitute for practice. It's not a substitute for hard work. We really do expect our students to be doing all this work, practicing lots and lots, learning lots and lots, doing lots of practice papers outside of their tutorials, so that when they come to the tutorials, they can really focus on the high level stuff. They can really focus on the things that they find very, very difficult.
Yeah, so the sort of third part of a program really are the weekly enrichment seminars. So we're here to aiming to replicate an Oxbridge style tutorial supervision. So we have various streams. And so depending on your subject, you'd be joining that sort of relevant stream. And each week we're looking at a different topic within that subject. So in the case of medicine, for example, one week you might be looking at sepsis. Another week you might be looking at human factors and errors in medicine. The idea is to broaden your knowledge of these different topics over the year. But actually, I think more importantly is to help you develop where your interests are within your topic so that you can really delve into those interests. So every week there's a handout which introduces the topic and there's pre-reading for you to do. And then you attend the topic. They're live and interactive, so you can really delve into that topic and practice sort of increasing your confidence in discussing these topics within your supervision groups as well. So we see this has quite a sort of direct impact on interview preparation, as well as more generally being a bit of a nice springboard into university, actually.
And we've got a clip from one of our, this is from the medicine stream, and actually it's one of our medical tutors who is a medical student at Cambridge, explaining sort of what she sees as the point of these seminars, and it echoes very well what James has been explaining. Do let me know if you can't hear her.
This whole enrichment is supposed to be 24. It's supposed to guide you throughout your application with your wider reading. So
oh, she's gone.
Everyone
She's back.
knows that you have to do wider reading to support your medical application, to sort of demonstrate that you have an insight into medicine. But the other thing that these enrichment supervisions will do is supposed to help you increase your confidence in discussing these different aspects of your wider reading, because that's what you're going to be asked to do at interview. So I think the best place to start building up your confidence is probably on here and talking in this group. And hopefully throughout all of the wider reading that we'll be doing with you, you'll be feeling a bit more prepared for life as a medical student and as a doctor as well.
Yeah, so the seminars really are geared towards what we've been talking about today, making sure that when you come to write your personal statement, when you come to interviews, you've got a really strong base of understanding and experience. Which brings us on to the last part, James.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last part are our intensive courses. So really these are kind of 1 or 2 day courses. And the aim really is to consolidate everything that you've been doing over the year. So depending on the subject, there's an intensive course for a personal statement, for the test, for the interview. Will, I like your analogy of sort of driving tests. It's the same kind of thing. Before you have your driving test, you have a mock test with your instructor. It's the same kind of thing, just making sure that you're fully ready for the real thing. These sort of students are working in small groups and a tutor. So I think it also allows you that opportunity for a bit of collaboration. And it serves as quite a nice sort of bookend to everything you've been doing for that sort of part of your preparation too. So these take place sort of a bit closer to the real thing, as it were, throughout the year.
Yeah, so my driving instructor, his sort of philosophy behind it was if you know that however many percentage people fail their first driving test, you may as well do your first driving test in a fake driving test scenario, and then pass your second one, which is the real thing. So I failed when I did my mock driving test with him, but then passed in the real thing. And it is really there to make sure, like you said, James, to make sure that you're happy across the board, you've covered everything. You can see what other people have been getting up to and really walk into the thing confident in a few weeks' time. But yeah, and it's ideally you're not learning anything new at that point. Ideally, you're all sorted. And ultimately, we do our best to try and make sure that our students are as well prepared as possible for the application process at Oxford or Cambridge. We focus on that 70% in the admissions test and the interviews and the personal statement. And so far that seemed to pay off quite well. A lot of our students have done very, very well in their application process. We are trying to push that number up as high as we can. But, you know, for the kind of subjects that our students are going for, the economics, computer science, the engineering, the really competitive courses, you know, we're very happy being able to gotten the majority of them offers. And of course, it sort of compares to what's going on in the wider environment. Obviously, our students come from a huge range of schools all across the country, all across the world. And you can actually see, so this information is published by Oxford and Cambridge each year. They publish the data on which schools have sent students to apply and how many of them have gotten offers. And you can see that even some of the very, very high-end, very, very expensive independent schools, they're sort of, I think the top is Westminster with about 50% of their students getting offers. Now, it is one thing that's worth saying is the more students you send, the more difficult it is to get as high a proportion of them in it. It's very easy to get a 50% acceptance rate when you're only sending 2 people. Well, not very easy, but easier. It's harder when you're sending 108 like Westminster are. But, you know, last year we had a few hundred students under our wings. So even with that difficulty, we're still able to make sure that the vast majority of them are getting into where they want to be getting in. James, do you want to talk a bit about what we're looking for in students that we speak with?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is, you know, quite a good thing to talk about, actually. So academics are obviously very important. You know, every course has a benchmark really that you're sort of aiming for and obviously want to exceed. But the very reason that the universities implemented the admissions tests was to more effectively differentiate between all of those academically strong candidates. So whilst we would like to work with candidates who are strong academically, actually it's the student's attitude that is really, really important. You know, we have programs that really do work. Everything's there for you to succeed, but ultimately also comes down to you. You know, how dedicated and how motivated are you to do this? And when I speak with parents and students, you know, that's for me one of the most, if not the most important thing about all of this. You know, how much do you want to study this course? You know, and how hard are you prepared to work? So yeah, I think sort of attitude really trumps everything else. Yeah,
definitely. And one feedback that I often get each year from students that we help and they get offers is they're often quite surprised because other students in their class will have had higher GCSEs than them, better predicted A levels than them, and they don't get offers, but they do. And ultimately I say, well, it's because you worked really hard for this. You put in the effort and they probably didn't. And in the end, that is what makes the difference. And we do, you know, when we take on students, we do say to them that we expect you to be, you know, to be hardworking. We expect you to be responsive to your tutor. We expect you to not cancel at the last minute and not show up to tutorials, because ultimately we put a lot of effort into the programs and we want it to work for you. And that's sort of the kind of minimum that we'd want from a student. And I think it's quite important because ultimately our tutors don't really want to be chasing around people and having to sort of continuously follow up. They want to be able to teach you. They want to be able to focus on helping you be a really, really strong candidate. And so our students are very, you know, quite mature, very responsible for themselves. And that's really, really important. We do have, I mean, so hopefully the stuff that we do is reflected in the reviews that we get. You know, we have a lot of very complimentary people saying nice things about us. But, you know, this is across a range of different things. So some students will have been in a full program and we've supported them get into Oxford or Cambridge. Other people might have just gotten some advice from our pages or, you know, bought one of our books. And ultimately, whatever kind of interaction you have with us, whether it's, you know, very, very supportive or not as supportive, maybe just quite minimal, it's always helpful to get feedback about what it's been like, how it's been for you. You know, if you have feedback for us about this open day, please do whack it in. I think we use Trustpilot predominantly is what we look at. And it doesn't always have to be positive. You know, it's always nice when it's positive, but actually we can do more when it's negative. We can make more changes when it's negative. So, you know, don't feel like you have to give 5-star reviews. If you do want to, that's great. But again, I think it's important for us, well, any company really, to have a balanced amount of reviews, and reviews that we can actually do something about, and then we can be better and help more students further down the line. So yeah, James, anything on reviews you wanted to say?
Other than the sort of issue that takes place every week on these open days that I'm yet to feature in a review. But
James,
I'm hoping I will my name will appear one day.
James hasn't had a shout out yet, guys, and I think he'd really appreciate it. He's put in a lot of work. This gets mentioned relatively often, and still no one does it. So if you, out of the goodness of your heart, and try not to make it too low a review as well. I think that would be that would be worse.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is our cooling off period. So you might be sat there thinking, well, I've not really done too much about my application so far. I am very hardworking, I am very committed, but I just haven't been told, you know, I haven't had any guidance, and I think a program sounds good. But what if I chat to these guys? What if we set it all up and it doesn't work and I don't like it? Well, ultimately, as with most things, we've thought of that. And whenever a student enrolls, basically before their 3rd week or before their 3rd tutorial, they have the option to withdraw from their program and they get a full refund. So you can have up to 2 tutorials, you can go to a couple of enrichment seminars, you can browse all the materials and resources. And if it's not quite right, you know, James and I do really work as hard as we can to make sure we're taking on the right kind of students, but it doesn't mean we're infallible. Sometimes there might not be the right kind of fit. If it doesn't work, we don't want students in programs that aren't working for them. Okay, so ultimately, whenever a student joins with us, they are putting their trust in us, definitely, but it's not a complete leap of faith, because there's certainly the opportunity for you to reevaluate whether or not this is actually the right thing for you. Okay. And I think, let's talk about the foundation as well, because, well, it's something that we're quite proud of. It's something which I'm always really happy about. So last year, we supported 93 students with applications to Oxford or Cambridge and for medicine across universities, completely for free. So they had tutorials, they had resources, they came to enrichment seminars, all those different bits and pieces, we supported them for free. Now, the point of this is we want people, you know, if you're looking at this and you think this is good, but you're thinking, actually, I'm worried that this isn't something I'm going to be able to afford. We want to be able to help everyone, or as many people as we can. And this is really there to help those kind of people. You know, if you're worried about finances, then it's likely that we are as well. And we want to try and do something to support you. Our target for this year is to help 250 students. Now, I don't think we're anywhere close to having had that many applicants. So if you or someone you know is thinking that this might be relevant, then please do apply. You can apply through the website uniadmissions.co.uk/foundation. You need to write a little personal statement and have a reference from a teacher. And then hopefully we'll be able to help you with your application. Okay, marvelous. I think that's, I did want to, just one more thing. I wanted to plug the podcast that Rohan and I do. So Rohan is the founder of UniAdmissions, and he and I try to, whenever we can, set aside some time to have a chat. Very often it's relevant to Oxford and Cambridge, but also it's sometimes relevant to other things. So we're both quite interested in science, so we'll often talk about things like that. So we try not to keep it too stuffy and boring and only about applications, but there is helpful information in there as well. Please do check it out if you think it might be something which might be helpful for you. Okay, and that brings us to the end of what we were going to talk about. You can see in the background is a very helpful demonstration of how to get onto our website and book a consultation, so book a one-to-one conversation with us. James and I are going to run through the Q&A. Please do carry on sending questions in. But if there are very, very niche and specific questions, which you have, very, very specific to your scenario, it might be that we say, actually, that's something that we'd need to know a bit more about and something that we'd need to have a conversation about. Students and parents can sometimes be a bit frustrated at me when I say, sorry, I can't tell you that without more information. but rarely when we come to applications is there something as simple as a yes no answer. Usually the short answer is it depends, and the long answer is can I ask you 10 more questions? And that's quite tricky to do in this kind of format, and naturally not as helpful for everyone else. So if it is too specific, we're not trying to be difficult. We just want to make sure we're not giving advice which is misinformed. Okay. So James, if you want to do pick out any ones that you want to answer, otherwise we'll just we'll go through things. So someone has asked, how important are GCSEs? If so, can 4A stars predicted counteract this for Oxbridge? So there's a little bit of again, this is one where we would definitely need to talk. But more broadly, one thing that I can say is GCSEs matter more for Oxford than they do for Cambridge. The reason being is that Oxford will shortlist who they interview much more strictly than Cambridge will. So Cambridge, broadly speaking, interview somewhere in the region of about 80% of all the students that apply to them. So pretty much everyone will get an interview. Oxford, on the other hand, it's more around the 30–40% mark. So for Cambridge, if you're a little bit low on the GCSEs, you might still be able to get into interview, at which point you might be able to prove to them that you are a strong candidate. Alternatively, Oxford, it might be that you aren't able to make it to that point. So for you, specifically for your GCSE grades, we'd need to go into that in more detail, but that hopefully is a bit of more broad information that should be relevant to quite a few people. You got any questions you like the look of, James?
Yeah, so somebody earlier on asked whether they should be writing notes when they read or just reading as much as possible. And I think, we sort of covered that really, but again, sort of, what I always say is, analyze, don't just read. There's nothing worse than sort of reading through a few pages and then sort of, your eyes glazing over and just thinking, I'm not quite sure what I've just read there. So absolutely, you should be making notes. Yeah, I just make that a habit. So when you're reading, you're habitually, writing notes, and sort of chunking and checking what you've been reading as well. Somebody else asks about a recording of this webinar. So on our homepage, so UniAdmissions.co.uk, we sort of slap bang in the middle, we have a section for open days. So it gives you details of the upcoming open days, but it will also give you a link to the most recent open day. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Will, I think that they upload those on Wednesday.
So yeah, it normally takes us a few days to basically just get it all sorted. But it should be, we try to make it as available as soon as we can, really. But so early next week to middle next week should be there.
And one last one from this chat box. Will interviews be in person this year? So the answer is yes. So Oxford, sorry, the answer is no, rather. Oxford and Cambridge have confirmed, sorry, I read that as virtual. So Oxford and Cambridge have confirmed that interviews will be virtual this year.
Yeah. Which is, of course, a shame, because it's always nice to go up and visit for a few days. But it does mean that you want to get quite used to being in doing your interview virtually. So if your school offers you mock interviews and they say, let's do it after school once you're out of your maths class, and they have it in a room, it might be worth saying, actually, do you mind if we do this in separate rooms and do it over Zoom, or whatever it is, because that's how it's going to be in the real thing. And I want to try and get as realistic an experience as possible. That the school shouldn't be too offended, and that should be actually better for you. We've got someone, Hamza has asked, if I'm applying for the economics and management course at Oxford, can I read one book related to economics and one related to management, and include that into my personal statements? I would recommend you read a lot more than one of each. But you certainly, for joint schools, for joint subjects, you certainly want to demonstrate interest and understanding and investment in all the subjects that you're applying for. One thing that E&M applicants often get wrong is they think it's just economics. But if you apply and it's really clear that you have no understanding of management and no interest in it, they will not accept you. You know, they are looking for students specific to that course. So you do want to spread your personal statement, and you do want to be including things about management on that. Okay. Someone has said, should we not shy away from criticizing the work of Nobel Prize winners? They're applying for E&M, so would it be okay to criticize Krugman? So I'm a experimental psychologist, so I have no idea who Krugman is. Maybe I should. I would say it's, you know, no one is infallible, and certainly it's much better to criticize someone's work than themselves. So again, using I think this was posted before we talked about sort of criticizing people. Using that example, I wouldn't go in your personal statement saying Krugman doesn't know what he's talking about. I would say, you know, Krugman's done some really interesting work that I've read, but I did have a few questions which I didn't feel he answered, or whatever it is. You know, you can be constructive in the way that you're criticizing someone. You can say he's missed out some things which maybe are relevant now but weren't relevant then. There's lots of different ways that you could criticize work. Don't be afraid to say if something doesn't make sense to you, or something doesn't seem right, or something seems misinformed. They might in the interview say, you know, that was interesting that you picked up on that. Can you tell us more? So be prepared to, you know, talk about it. But equally, don't criticize something just because that's part of your internalized dogma. Do it in an evaluative way.
A couple of people are saying nice things about us.
Okay,
Thank you very much. A couple of people are asking about, you know, the possibility of sort of joining a program, that kind of thing. Really, the first step would be to have a chat, you know, with myself or one of the team, because we'd really love an opportunity to get to know you and your application a little bit more, and to sort of think about how we could support you with this. So please do visit the website. You can sort of book a time slot to have a chat with one of us, or you can sort of you know, more generally make an inquiry. Somebody else also asks when's the best time, or a couple of questions along the lines of when's the best time to start. I mean, ultimately, I've always said that the early you start, the better. However, the caveat to that is it's not always about how long you spend doing something. It's about the manner in which you're doing it. So ultimately, we do like to start working with students as early as possible, but we really do want to be working consistently with you. So, you know, there are multiple sort of points of entry throughout the year. We work with students in some instances, you know, well before the year of their applications. You know, really, again, it's about having a chat. So let's find out a bit more about you, where you are within all of this, and then, you know, think about things going forward. I hope that's not too vague.
No, that's good. Ultimately, what we want to do is whatever time you come to us, if you say, I want to get to Oxford, we want to come up with something which is going to help you do that. And now there are some students that come to us in year 11, some students that come to us in year 10, and they'll say, you know, we want to go to Oxford, what can we do? And at that point, we have designed programs specifically to help support younger students through a multiple year program. But actually, that's not always right for everyone. Sometimes someone in year 10 will come to us and will say, actually, we don't think you're quite ready for this yet. So why don't we reevaluate things next year, or something along those lines? So earlier is always better. You always want to make sure you're making the most of the time you have available. And certainly, you know, you've got big summer holidays between year 11 and year 12, less big summer holidays between year 10 and year 11. It's always worth using that time, because year 12 is going to be busy, year 13 is going to be busier. But equally, if you're sat there thinking, well, I've got my interview in 6 months, what we want to do then is use that 6 months as well as possible, give you the best shot at this. We're taking on students on a rolling basis, so we are taking on students all the time. We've got someone who asked a good question of what would the pie chart look in the pre-interview selection process. So actually, Oxford are quite explicit about this. Before they interview you, it's basically 50% test, 50% GCSEs. So this is why I say, if your GCSEs are slightly lower, you don't have as much space to hide in, because they take up 50%. And actually, the predicted grades don't matter too much. because GCSEs are much stronger predictors of A-level performance. And there was an article which said that about 80% of predicted grades are wrong. So, you know, GCSEs are actually used pretty heavily by Oxford. For Cambridge, it's going to shift towards the non-interview aspects, but I think they do spend some time looking into the personal statements. And they also have, of course, their SAQs, which will also be taken into that consideration. So for those of you that don't know, SAQs are basically on the 15th of October, you have your application deadline. And then within the next 7 days, Cambridge wants you to fill in it's basically an extra questionnaire where they gather lots and lots of information about you, you know, into as much detail as how big your class sizes are at school. So they really want to know as much as they can about you. You can also put in another mini personal statement. So if you're wondering whether or not you should, why not? Why not use that opportunity to try and impress them some more? But yeah, so they do look at some other stuff, whereas Oxford, it's pretty much test and GCSEs. It's kind of ruthless. And so being aware of that is important, because it might actually inform what you actually do. And yes, someone was saying, is the pie chart weighted between predicted grades and GCSEs? It is, but it's weighted more in favor of GCSEs, really.
So somebody's asking about sort of the nuances of Cambridge and Oxford, in the fact that, you know, Cambridge typically interview far more candidates than Oxford do, and therefore, you know, in the Cambridge application, is it more based on interview performance? You know, Will, please, you know, give me your input on this, but I would say that ultimately it's the same combination. Ultimately, they're looking at you holistically. All those things is just to get into an interview at Oxford. It's a little bit more ruthlessly based on data. Would I be right in saying that, do you think, Will?
Yes. So once you're past the interview, the way that they evaluate you is quite similar, you know, across the different parts of the application process. The difference is, if you think, you know, my GCSEs are pretty low, but actually I've got a really strong interview. I could interview really well. I've prepared. I let myself down with my GCSEs, or I was let down with my GCSEs, but I can really make a big difference at the interview. Then Cambridge might be a better place for you to apply. On the other hand, if you're thinking, you know, my interview isn't weak, but I know that there's going to be lots of other strong candidates, and I've actually got really strong GCSEs to fall back on. Plus, I've been practicing my TSA, my LNAT, whatever it is, a lot, and I'm doing really well on there. Because if you're in that scenario, then you can cut out a lot of your competition by applying to Oxford. So for some people, it might be tactically better to apply to Cambridge. For some people, it might be tactically better to apply to Oxford. I'm being very cautious when I talk about tactical applications, because really, you should be applying for the course that is best for you. That is one of the biggest things to be wary of. You know, there are differences between all the courses offered at Cambridge and all the ones offered at Oxford. Even if it's, you know, one is English and the other is English, there will still be differences in the courses. And so you as an individual might be more suited for one over the other. So you'd be a stronger candidate for one over the other. But equally, you should marry that with, I guess, a sensible approach. If your GCSEs are low and you're applying for something like English, then yeah, it might be that you might want to apply to Cambridge. Even if Oxford's course is slightly more geared towards you, I'm sure that the Cambridge one you'll be able to work towards as well.
And we did actually have an open day specifically on the subject of Oxford versus Cambridge.
Yeah.
So that might be a good place to start if anybody's a bit sort of wants to find out any more information about that or delve into that. We did a sort of separate open day on that topic.
Yeah, yeah. Someone did ask. It's quite a it's a good question about what do we mean by primary texts, and just in case we didn't cover that well enough. So to give you an example, a secondary text would be a 1980s historian writing a book on World War II and the contributing factors. A primary text would be letters sent from yeah, I don't know, German diplomats to wherever it is, Czechoslovakia or the UK. So things which are indicative of or made during the time. You could even have a historian in the 1940s writing about what's going on at the time. That would still be a primary text, but secondary texts are sort of things writing about the primary texts. Okay, so that's history as an example. In science, basically the primary text would be the initial research paper. So your intro, your methods, your results, your conclusions. The secondary would be the review, the meta-analysis, the review that's done years down the line, sort of compiling everything. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, we've got lots and lots of questions today, so that's keeping us very busy. We've got a question from Calvin saying, if your GCSEs were not fantastic, but your sixth form predicted grades are good, does it matter? Will they still look at your GCSE grades? So this does happen, Calvin. There are some students who don't quite kick things into gear in GCSEs. They don't quite engage with their subjects, but then in A-level, they really step into their stride. The short answer is that your GCSEs can still pull you down if your test isn't good. So if your GCSEs are low and your test is low, but your A-level predictions are high, they're more likely to question whether or not the A-levels is the erroneous bit rather than the GCSEs. If your GCSEs are low, but your test is fantastic, your test is the top 5% of the year, and your A-level predictions are really high, then they're more likely to think that actually the GCSEs are erroneous. One thing that students in your situation do often do is they apply once they have the A-level grades in hand. And that really removes any doubt for Oxford or Cambridge if it's the GCSEs or the A-levels that are erroneous. So if you've got GCSEs which are mostly 7s and 6s, you're predicted 3 A stars at A-level and you get that. Once you've got those 3 A stars, they will pretty happily ignore the GCSEs. Okay, but whilst it's predicted, they'll still be a little bit worried which one is the best indicator of you. You can try and clarify that through the test. But yeah, that's sort of the long answer. These are always going to be long answers, I'm afraid, that there are rarely short answers.
Somebody has asked, so should I not be worried if I only meet the entry requirements of the course? So I think that's quite a good point to quickly touch on, actually. Entry requirements are minimum entry requirements. So ultimately, it's not the nicest way to think about this, really, is it? But ultimately, this is a competition of sorts. So ultimately, it's a competition of fine margins. So yes, whilst you might meet the threshold, really anything above that, should be what you're aiming for. Ultimately, you've got to try and do the best in every part of the application to give yourself the overall strongest chance. I hope I sort of articulated that well. Do you have any comments on that, Will?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to bear in mind is that if you are meeting the minimum entry A-level requirements, then you are by default the one of the weakest applicants that they have, because there are no students in terms of A-level predictions. There are no students, or there might be a handful, but there's effectively no students with lower predicted grades than you. Okay, now that's not the end of the world, because we know that the predicted A-levels only contribute, between 10 and 15% of the overall decision. But what it does mean is that you're going to need to be punching above that weight for the other parts of the application. So, if you're bottom 5% in terms of your A-levels, you'd want to be top 10% in your test, because the test carries about twice as much weight, and you need to combat that. That's a decent way to think about it, but really, why limit yourself to top 10%? You should be shooting for as high as you can. But yeah, students will occasionally apply with slightly below the minimum entry requirements, very occasionally, and they can actually still get offers. But again, they just have to blow the admissions tutors away with the other parts of the application. No admissions tutor is going to refuse someone who scored the top score in their admissions test that year. It's not going to happen. They will be interested in you, and they will definitely want to speak with you, at the least. So, these are the things that you can really focus on. If you've got flawless A stars at GCSEs, frankly, so is everyone else. But there's only one person who's got the best TSA score that year. And if you can make that you, then you've just made yourself a very, very interesting candidate. So yeah, let's move through that. Someone has asked, when does the cycle for next year applications to UniAdmissions start? So we're taking on students, like I said, we take on students at a rolling basis. Our year 12 cohort are obviously breaking up for summer and moving into year 13 and making their application. But we also have a cohort of students who are a year behind that who have started. Ultimately, the specific kind of program you'd be on really does depend on you. And you know, it will be down to me, James, one of the team, to have a chat with you about it. And it might be that we say, actually, based on everything you said, let's put a pin in this and start in a few months' time, or whatever it is. Or we might say, actually, based on what you've told me, I think let's get going. Let's start working away on things. Let's start using this summer holiday. Use it well, because it would be very tempting to not use it well, and you'll be kicking yourself further down the line when you've got 3-4 A levels to be managing and everything else. Although please do enjoy having done your GCSEs, because well done, you've made it. Okay, so Cambridge interview 80%, there will be more reduction. Okay, I think this is the question that you answered earlier, actually.
Yeah.
Someone has asked, is 6 9s and 4 8s good for Oxbridge? Want to do medicine, got all 9s in sciences. So we can go through a specific example because they've asked so politely. We have the average Oxford medic will have 10.2 A stars at GCSE. So you're slightly below the average, but like I said, you know, that means you're in the running. Okay, so have a strong BMAT, definitely have a strong interview, all those bits and pieces. If you have no 7s or 6s, then you're slightly above the average in terms of ratio of A stars to non-A stars. So when it comes to GCSEs, they measure 2 things: total number of A stars and ratio of A stars to non-A star grades. So actually having 10 A stars, 2 A's and a B is actually worse than just having 10 A stars. Those extra GCSEs don't give you anything. Now they do this because certain students don't have, you know, their schools don't offer them multiple A stars. So they don't want students being counted out just because they've not had that opportunity. But, you know, it's really something worth bearing in mind. If you are, you know, at the very early stage, let's say you're at year 10, you might be thinking about, well, do I really need to do 13, 14 GCSEs? If you can do them and get all A stars, fantastic. You know, why not? But ultimately, that's always a discussion that you can be having. Okay, James, any questions you like the look of?
Straining my eyes to see these.
Okay.
Somebody says, can we give them some tips and tricks for the TSA? Very polite question, but I would say in this webinar, perhaps not. But one of our tutors certainly can. So please have a chat with us. Let's explore that a little bit more.
Yeah.
But thank you for the question.
Yeah, we've got some questions about international applicants. So there's one about the different APs offered by either you're in America or you're at an American international school. Broadly speaking, it's always safest to check the international entry requirements with Oxford and Cambridge directly. We have an article about how to do that, actually, an article that I wrote, as it happens. So I hope that's available. So if you Google or search in our search bar, you know, international applicants, that should pop up how to find that information. Off the top of my head, I think they'll consider that as 2 different subjects, but again, it's always worth checking that directly with the universities. We've got some people asking for like acceptable admissions test ranges. Again, there are some articles which cover that, but that's probably something either to chat with us about or do a bit of research on. I haven't been paying attention to the chat, so I'm just going to have a quick look through there. Someone else should be writing notes. Yes, please do write notes when you read. Some questions about getting links. I think we've gone through the majority of these questions, or sort of similar versions of these questions. Yeah, okay, let me just see if there's anything we've missed, or any big questions that we've missed. Some people have asked for sort of magazines or ideas for recommended reading. I would, again, start with, so again, I'm a psychologist by training, so I've got some ideas on that front, but I would start with asking at school. I would start with having a look at the different medical schools pages and start there. If you've got someone, or I mean, again, one of our students, I'd say have a chat with your tutor about it, that kind of thing. But yeah, there are lots of good places that you can get going. If there are, I think we've sort of come to that. There are a few questions about balancing the amount of space in your personal statement with the amount of evaluation that you want to do. Now, this is where the art of writing a personal statement comes in. It's not easy. You're quite limited in terms of how much space you've got, and you want to try and talk about a lot of things. I think what you have to do is really, put more effort into that particular, we talked earlier about having a particular area that you're very interested in yourself. And, spending a bit more evaluation on that, but maybe spending a little less evaluation on other texts that you're talking about. That way you're able to fit things in, but you're not, but you're still able to fit in the, the evaluative side of things. Ultimately, like I say, it's a bit of an art. It's a bit of an iterative process. So hopefully you'll be reading and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting your personal statement many, many times to really get it right. And if you're worried about how to start, just start writing something. You can rewrite it, I promise. And that way you'll at least be able to get things going. The specifics of those kind of things is quite difficult to go through, but yeah, you just need to try and find the balance as much as possible. Okay, James, any last questions that you like the look of?
Unless I'm missing something, I think we've covered everything.
Okay.
Yeah, unless you can spot any, I think we've gone through them all. But remember, if you do have a question, a burning question for us, we've somehow missed your question, or you'd like to explore, one of our answers a bit more, please do book to have a chat with us. We'd be very happy to do that and talk to you about your application.
There's one more question about if you can demonstrate like your interest in your supracurricular rather. If it only has to be books, or if it can be through online courses and other things like that. Absolutely, it can be through online courses. I would bear in mind that, Oxford and Cambridge are academic places, so they are looking for people who can read books and articles, so don't only do online courses. But yeah, online courses are really, really good. There's lots of things, there are often things offered by, I think a lot of the American universities offer various courses across a huge range of subjects. So those are really good things to look into. In terms of documentaries, it does depend, because documentary is quite a broad term, but certainly there will be good ones that you can include there. Okay, I think we will wrap things up there. It's 3:30. I'm sure these lovely people have much better things to be getting on with for the rest of their day. But, thank you everyone for coming along. Hopefully this was helpful, and hopefully you've got a bit to take away from it. Unless you have anything else to add, James, I think let's say goodbye and have a nice weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very nice to meet you all in this strange virtual way that we have. But right. Yeah, have a lovely weekend.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.